more recently, Kentucky's greatest natural asset. Not how I would put it, but it's hard to say it's not true. Nearly 1 million acres of some of the most biologically rich forest on Earth. Absolutely incredible. And me, at least, I have concerns about the plan that they're moving forward with, that it's going to become more and more critical if you share any of those concerns, that we all get together and come up with a game plan for in this early part of 2019. So I'm not going to say much more, except that there's a lot of potential in this project, but there's also way too much at risk. And we need to think really hard about how much of that risk we're willing to accept, and how much we should try to eliminate. But with that, I'll turn it over to Jim, who's the Executive Director of Kentucky Heartwood. We'll probably tell you a little bit about who the heck Kentucky Heartwood is, and more importantly about the specifics of this project.
Thanks, Austin. So I'm Jim Sheva. I've been with Kentucky Heartwood for a little over 10 years now, and I've been involved in public lands advocacy in different ways, shape, or form for almost 20 years now. And like many of you, I'm sure, this section of Degrading National Forest is I think the best. And well, I'll tell you a little bit about Kentucky Heartwood. We've been around for 26 years now, and for the first decade of our organization's existence, we were really just fighting an out-of-control Forest Service logging program, where the Forest Service was clear-cutting about 10,000 acres a year on the Beaver Meadows. And that's changed. Those levels have dropped substantially. Forestry has become better, but now we're dealing with the legacy of too much abuse on that landscape, which means in some cases there's work that needs to be done, and in other cases it means that those old models. It means that, so that legacy on the land means that we have a complicated balance of work that needs to be done in the forest and old models of forestry that, frankly, we don't think are appropriate on the Degrading National Forest. One of the things that I want to say as we go through this talk and hopefully discussion tonight is that land management and forests are complicated, and it is entirely possible and reasonable for people who are intelligent and well-meaning and sincere to come to different conclusions about what is the right course of action on a piece of land. And that is okay. We can have strong disagreements, but I always try to foster respect in those conversations. And the district staff with the Forest Service that work on this project, even though I disagree with them on certain aspects of this project and others, I like very much personally, and I think they're very hardworking professionals. And it's a little commentary, I think, that just what's going on right now with them not being able to work or having to work without pay is not okay. And unfortunate, and I do hope they are able to get back to work, even though I like having a little more time for us to work on this project. I'm going to be covering quite a bit of material tonight. This project is a complicated project that has a number of parts to it that all raise a number of issues. And many of the different pieces of this could be a whole nice conversation on their own. And so I'm going to move through a lot of material. But please ask questions throughout. We'll balance sort of those conversations and answer those questions with the need to sort of move through so we can have broader conversations that come after covering most of what they plan on doing with this project. So, Pine Creek project area. So this is the area that the Forest Service has defined. So this is a boundary based on a number of watersheds that the Forest Service drew many years ago as part of an analysis area. The green patches here are what's actually national forest land, and it's about 47,000 acres of national forest land. It excludes a good chunk of the Cane Creek WMA here, Parts of it are included there, but other parts are not. But otherwise, it includes most of the stuff along the Rockcastle corridor. It includes a lot of, a lot of great trails and recreation areas that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. I'm going to go over a number of these things in more detail, so don't worry. But these are first the commercial logging prescriptions that the Forest Service is proposing. And some of these are the things that we have the most concern about. So the first is 1,300 acres of what's called shelter wood logging to create early sterile habitat. There's going to be a little jargon in here. So early sterile habitat or early successional habitat, I might bounce between those two phrasings of it, is essentially brushy, grassy habitat that's important for a number of wildlife species. And the Forest Service tends to want to create that through large-scale logging, but as we'll talk about later, there's other ways you can achieve those goals that are more compatible with a bunch of other forest values. They propose 730 acres of logging. I'll say shelterwood logging. I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail in a bit, but that generally entails removing about 80% of the trees in a given area. They propose 730 acres of logging to create what's called woodland or wooded grassland forest types. So in those cases, they're talking about removing about 50 to 80% of the trees and repeatedly burning the area to create a certain fire-adapted type of forest community. And again, I'll be talking more about that. 40 acres of salvage logging from the lick fire. And then variable density thinning along about 13 miles of roadside, so about 60 feet more or less off each side of the road, doing some thinning for a number of different purposes. And then commercial thinning, about 600 feet around wildlife openings, so in the King Creek WMA and some other areas of the Forest Service, you've probably seen these. These are patches out in the forest that are mostly, sometimes in fescue, sometimes they're in corn, but they're wildlife openings, and what they want to do is open up the forest around those to make more of a gradient from that open area to the closed forest. And then they propose this, it was phrased a little weird in the proposal, but up to 2,000 acres of shelterwood logging after 10 years in stands that they're going to do mid-story reduction. I'm going to mention that again in a minute, the mid-story reduction. The Forest Service has verbally told me they're going to take that out of the proposal, but until it's on paper, it's not real. So that is part of the proposal, which would add up to about 3,300 acres of shelterwood if they do that. So then there's a bunch of non-commercial forest management also, and most of this is pretty good. So 1,200 acres of crop tree release. What that is as I said, in the 1980s and 1990s, Forest Service clear-cut a lot of forest, and a lot of that forest is in really, really bad shape. A lot of what's come up is stump-sprouted, multi-stemmed red maple, tulip poplar, and a lot of the oaks and hickories and good mass-producing species that produce a lot of food for wildlife are being outcompeted by these other trees. And so what they do is go in and lop down, sometimes with saws, sometimes with herbicide. Will take out some of the competing trees around some of the trees that they want to promote. 2,700 acres of mid-story removal. There's a lot of our forests, for some complicated, only partially understood reasons, have a very dense mid-story of red maple. So if you go in a lot of typical upland forests around here, you'll see a lot of oaks and hickories about this big, and a ton of red maples about this big. There's a lot of belief and understanding that the forests are kind of skewed, and that's sort of a legacy of land use history. But it's creating a lot of shade that makes it harder for oaks to get established in the understory. So they want to go in and lop down a lot of those maples, and in some cases use herbicide, usually a stump treatment. 160 acres of non-commercial thinning for woodland creation, similar to I was talking about commercial thinning, but this would just be cutting red maples and other trees that aren't really saleable. Non-commercial thinning around 600 feet around wildlife openings. Again, that's part of that commercial treatment. It's just depending on what's most appropriate on those sites. What they're calling cluster planting of shortleaf and pitch pine for restoration on 1,500 acres and woodland harvest sites. So what that is most of you probably remember from 99 to about 01, 02, the southern pine beetle knocked out a majority of the yellow pine, especially the shortleaf and pitch pine on the Danube. And what the Forest Service is planting here is actually pretty progressive, and I commend them on it. Instead of the old style, which is essentially plantation style planting of pine, they're talking about planting these patches in areas that's definitely more naturalistic approach, definitely more nuanced approach to help create sort of a mixed hardwood pine stands in the end. It's an interesting approach that they're attempting. And then planting mass-producing trees, so persimmons, oaks, and so on wildlife openings and some of the shelter cuts. So I know that's a lot. We'll go through some of it in more detail. So again, this is the project area, and I want to point out a few things on this map. So this is the King Creek Wildlife Management Area here. You see a little bit of it's in the project area.
So if you've hiked Van Hook Falls, is probably the most well-known feature in the Cane Creek Wildlife Management Area.
Yeah. So up here is, you might have read about how the state recently acquired land they designated as the Rockcastle River Wildlife Management Area that the Kentucky Division of Fish and Wildlife Management owns and manages, and that's this. The Danube National Forest is proposing on adding this part to the WMA to be managed cooperatively with the state. This green dotted line here is the Sheltoe Trace, and then these dotted lines are all other trails in the area. This is World Lake here. So in this map, you see the red blobs are where they're proposing to do shelterwood harvest. The orange blobs are where they're proposing to do woodlands, and then this sort of pink and purple area is mostly the salvage logging proposal. And that doesn't look like very much on that map when you just look at this here. But context really matters. That historical context is really important. So the next slide is the same map, but adds in all the stands that the Forest Service logged and essentially clear cut in the 1980s and 1990s. So all those green spots, those are all young forest stands, small trees. A lot of them are in really bad shape. So again, when you just look at that, it looks fairly conservative. It's a huge land base. That's not a whole lot. But when you look at that history, the relatively recent history as far as the forest goes, we see it as a little bit differently. And we'll have some close-ups of some of these areas, so we can talk about some of these specific spots where we're proposing some of this most intensive timber management. So shelterwood logging. Again, this is, as an organization, this is our greatest concern because it's the most severe management that they're proposing on the landscape. It has a lot of impacts on the land. It's not as bad as the old clear cutting. It does leave some overstory trees, but it has a lot of impacts, even though it is the predominant forestry prescription that a lot of foresters support in this day and age for a number of reasons. It's an efficient way to get a lot of logs out for sure. So this is a log landing. This is the Brushy Ridge project up in Jackson County in the London district. This was from a few years ago. And one of the biggest impacts with logging like this, it's not just the trees that are falling or not there anymore. It's the ground disturbance that happens to get those trees out. So these big areas are cleared out, bulldozed, compacted, in order to get the trucks in and the load, to stack and load the logs. They make a lot of these, and they can do them a lot smaller, but this sort of scale is considered acceptable to the Forest Service. By comparison, the recent Greenwood project that was approved a couple years ago on the Stearns District in McCreary and Pulaski County, about the same scale of project. They anticipated about 130 log landings for that project. And so we could expect something probably not too dissimilar with the Pine Creek project that's implemented as they're suggesting. So a lot of areas disturbed in this way. So this is another stand in the Russian Creek project using satellite imagery. So you can see about 80% of the canopy was removed. And all these are what the Forest Service calls temporary roads. They bulldoze these roads all through the forest. You can see them for decades, and invasive species becoming established on them is a regular problem. If you don't know where this is, here's the Turkeyfoot campground, which a lot of folks are familiar with. Damaged residual trees is a normal thing. You see a lot of them. We actually cataloged them on this project. Plainville Forest Service wrote a letter. They went out, looked at it, and said that the levels of damage were acceptable. This is the Group 1 Redbird project. I can't remember if this one's on the Clay or Leslie County side. This is in 2010. That's in 2013. And it's another Shelterwood prescription. You can see all these bulldozed roads through here. They go up and down here. We bushwhacked through some horrendous stuff up there recently to take a close look. And there are a number of problems with it that we expect. So you do get this. This is really good early sterile habitat. It's good for a number of wildlife species, a number of migratory songbirds, but there's problems that come along with it, especially at that scale. So lots of invasive species. So here's a big patch of kudzu that's now growing in that stand that was forest. This was a logging road that they built here that zigzags all the way up the mountain. Tons of Japanese honeysuckle all throughout the stand, up and down, and not just a few plants here, and not even just restricted to those temporary roads, but full-on infestations of it. And we found Chinese privet and Japanese silkgrass and multiflora rose and autumn olive and Sericea lespedeza, which are all really problematic invasive species. This is where they bulldozed. You see they rip, this is a white oak here that was supposed to be left, and the roots are just bulldozed through. It's not the only one like that. This is all Japanese silkgrass down here, and that's autumn olive. It's a mess. We wrote to the Forest Service. We asked what sort of standards they used for the operators, what follow-up they had. They said everything was done right, and this is within expected levels. And we'll go back and try to treat some of it with herbicide in the future, but it's far too much to really control. It's almost inevitable that this happens. So this is a trade-off, and it's a trade-off that the Forest Service finds acceptable, and we do not. Then what grows back? So this is pretty typical. This is a forest that was harvested in the 1990s. So you get these stump-sprouted or coppice-red maples. They really outcompete a lot of the other species in the area. They're not healthy forests. This is some language from, that Redbird project I showed a picture from, 2008. We opposed that. We actually had the Forest Service withdraw that project twice. They finally reissued it. It was a bit smaller in the end. This is what they wrote 10 years ago. Typically, the brushing phase only lasts from 1 to 10 years after the event. That's true. After that, the trees begin to take on the look and habitat function of the high canopy forest. So this stand here is probably about 25 or 35 years old. I don't think that this has the look, and certainly not the habitat function of a high canopy forest. I think that's a problem. I don't think all the foresters at this point would still say that, but this is not an atypical view. It places a lot of value on the recently cut forest, and again, this is just considered acceptable. Here's another one in the Redbird District where you can see these are all coppice, again, red maple and tulip poplar, not the oaks that probably would have been there before. So here's some of these areas a little more close up. I'll describe where these are as we move through them. Again, this here, the red blotches are proposed shelterwood, and these greens are stuff that was cut mostly in the 80s and 90s to provide some context, because again, I think that's really important. So here's the Rockcastle River. This is the Sheltoe Trace. This is Pine Island Branch. There's a waterfall here that's become increasingly popular recently. A lot of people are coming in right over here to get to it. So I proposed shelterwood cuts in these two stands and down here. I haven't been down here yet. There's some old growth, some really nice old growth actually along this piece of this stand right here. So if they cut these, essentially all of this area will have been cut in 30 years, 35 years. And there will be very few large trees, mature forests left in that whole big patch. Similarly here, so here's the Sheltoe Trace, here's 80, right here. And this Pine Creek, where the Rockcastle Bridge is just off the map here on 80. And so all of these areas here are proposed for shelterwood harvest. There's some really nice forests out over here, and some really nice forests out over here. We have to go part of the Sheltoe trace, you know, it's the road, and that'll be a logging road over here. They approved that. Here's another section. So this down here is Hawk Creek. This is just north of Hawk Creek. I think this is, I forget the branches. I think this is Wolf Fork maybe. This is a huge section of Dakota shelter over here. Really nice forest right over here. This is a mix of shelter wood and woodland restriction here. It's a hot place for it. And then this down south of the project, this is the Rock Castle campground. This is the Ned Ranch Trail right here. Big section shelter wood right there along the Ned Ranch Trail there. So those are some of the larger units of the shelterwood harvest that we're concerned about. And notice it's pretty much all on the east side of the river, which has also become one of the most popular recreational sections of the Danube Boone outside of the Red River Gorge in recent years. Another part of this project is prescribed fire, and generally we've been supportive of prescribed fire in this project area. About 9,300 acres were already approved for burning in 2014, and that's these orange hatched areas. Some of these are, this shows some that are outside of the project area, but all this, these little spots here. And Forest Service proposes adding about 2,400 acres, and that's the yellow hashed areas. Some of it we totally support, some of it find a little more questionable. Restoration of fire adapted landscapes. So this gets into some more bona fide restoration the Forest Service is proposing, and we think has the potential to be very good if done well. This is an interesting area that illustrates a number of things. So this is a spot where it had a lot of shortleaf pine before the pine beetle came in and knocked it out. The Forest Service followed up with prescribed fire, which was very appropriate for that site and area. And when the Forest Service burns, they have a very restricted set of environmental conditions where they're allowed to burn in order to minimize smoke, minimize fires getting out of control. But that doesn't always happen. And I'd argue that it's not always bad. It sometimes gets a little out of control because historically, if you think about when fires would have happened 300, 500, 1,000 years ago, it would have been more often late summer, fall, when things are hot and dry. If you can imagine a thunderstorm in a dry August that hits a tree, and that tree is smoldering for days, and after a couple of days that storm has gone through, it's gotten hot and windy, stuff's dried out, but that tree is still smoldering, and it throws some coals, hits some grasses or leaves, and then it can burn. And before there were roads everywhere and pasture and so on, those fires could have had a lot of impact. So they've done a prescribed fire here, and it got out of control and it burned hotter than they intended. But what that did was it actually hit some of the oaks a little too hard, but what that did was it helped promote the shortleaf pine. And that shortleaf pine needs a little hotter than fire. And so you get these younger pines coming up in there, and it's kind of a cool sight of what's going on out there. So that area, that site is actually in this section of the project area. So here's the Cumberland River, and here's the Rock Castle over here. So this is a Little Lick, Addison Branch is up in here. So this is, that section of Pulaski County here. There's a lot going on in this map, and I'll point out to you. So these orange blotches, that's the commercial woodland prescription. So again, cutting about 50 to 80% and burning. Most of this area is this whole area here is a burn prescriptions and what add this. These areas that are the sort of a green with the little wavy stuff in it, those are areas that were hit really hard by the southern pine beetle, where they want to plant pine using this cluster planting method. And then these yellow, spaghetti noodles are along the roads, and these are where they're proposing that roadside thing, which is something we generally support. That does a couple of things. One is it helps maintain the roads be a little easier. It helps the roads dry out. But the other thing we'll talk about in a minute, there's a number of rare grassland type species that are hanging on those roadsides, and that creates a little more space for some of these rare species. Taken as a whole, it's a really compelling approach to restoration of upland fire adapted communities in this area. And that does come out of many years of conversations between the Forest Service, Kentucky Heartwood, Kentucky Office of Nature Preserves, and the Nature Conservancy that we've had through a consortium called the Homeowner Refiner Learning Network. This illustrates some of what some of these things can look like. So this is a spot, this is down Stearns District, but they just had mid-story removal and fire. So cutting out those maples and burning. You can see just that compared to where that wasn't done before, so it's essentially the same. It opens that up. It makes a different habitat. On the far end of removing a lot of trees and also using herbicides and a number of other things, this is down in Tennessee, the Catoosa Wildlife Management Area, which is pointed to as sort of a goal of a lot of restoration for like a wooded grassland type, community type, which can be really good if done well, but it requires a lot of intensive management if done well. But this is sort of the vision of some of that area where there's been logging, fire, and other things to get these pretty diverse grassland for communities to come back in. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff sort of between those two descriptions there. Oldgrowth. So on the sort of the other end of the spectrum is oldgrowth, and my graduate research at Eastern was on oldgrowth, and oldgrowth develops on the lagoon, and I could talk for hours and hours and hours on this subject alone, but I won't. But there's a lot there, and so I'm going to try and just skim the surface of the issues with oldgrowth. To give a little bit of perspective, there's a couple of people there. I think one of those might be Sayara. A couple of concepts, though, that to put out there to help make some of this make sense. Old growth trees versus old growth forests. So we're talking about old growth. It can mean a lot of different things. But sometimes we're talking about old growth trees. So you might have a few trees that are really old, really large, in a forest that's really not old growth, but they're great trees. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have old growth forests. And that's really a whole forest that has a suite of structural or compositional characteristics that we would associate with old growth. And there's actually a gradient, because you can have forests that were long that still have a lot of old growth trees in them. And again, these things exist on gradients. On the other end is this idea of primary old growth versus secondary old growth. And that's another thing that comes into play in thinking about this project area. And what this is that primary old growth is forest that essentially has not been really disturbed by humans in the last couple hundred years. That doesn't mean there's been no disturbance. I mean, that's really an unrealistic benchmark. That almost doesn't exist in Eastern North America. But we have forests that come pretty close. But those are sort of your classic old growth, what in the old terminology we call virgin forest. And there is some of that in the Pine Creek project area. On the other end is this idea of secondary growth. And that's what my graduate research was on. And that's the idea that we have forests that have grown long enough to acquire a lot of the structure and function of primary old growth forests. And we have a lot of forest in this Pine Creek project area that is on the cusp of being bona fide secondary old growth. And in fact, this project area has more older secondary forests, older than 130 years old, than anywhere else on the Dana-Good National Forest. There's a lot of old secondary forest that is getting there. Here's says that approximately 11,000 acres are within riparian corridors and would be allowed to grow the older forest types. That sounds great. It sounds big, like a lot of land. But there's a couple issues here. So I think, first of all, they're combining riparian and probably some cliffline communities because there are some buffers where they tend to not log. But the issues are that these are narrow strips of forest. These aren't big contiguous sections of forest. These are margins. And I think that's an important difference in terms of thinking about functional old growth. Now they propose to add 500 acres of designated old growth. This is the first time we've seen them do this under this forest plan, which has been around since 2003. And this is something we've been urging them to add old growth prescriptions in the right areas. The problem with it is that So 370 acres that is adjacent to Rock Creek Research Natural Area, and it's almost all in hemlock forests, almost none of which are in the treatment program to save them from the hemlock woolly adelgid, which will in the next 10 years most likely kill all the hemlocks in those stands. So they're mostly in forests that are under the cliff line, not going to be logged anyway, and they're probably going to be dying anyway. So it's not really a good plan for conserving old growth, functional old growth on the landscape. The other area they're planning on adding is Angel Hollow. Again, 130 acres, but it's also beneath the cliff line area that it's pretty much maintaining its status.
Just to reiterate, the situation we have in the old forest on the Daniel Boone is that the way the Forest Service approaches these things is that stuff below the cliff line, stuff down next to the stream, stuff up under the rock shelter, that's where it's appropriate to have old forest function is how it ends up. And how it ends up also is that we end up having no forest that gets to develop that weird second growth characteristic up on the ridge tops. Even though historically and prehistorically, old forests in great amounts belong there just as much as they belong below the cliff line, down by the stream, down by the river, what have you.
No upland forest type proposed for old growth management. We actually proposed in our comments to the Forest Service last spring, we actually drew maps and delineated some large areas centered on these same areas, but that include large blocks of very old secondary forests into areas that could be managed for old growth. And that doesn't mean no management. That can mean fire management. That can mean even some thinning, but done with the right approaches and aimed at developing old growth structure as opposed to the typical timber management that they do, which is essentially simplifying forest structure and moving it away from old growth type forests. So at-risk old growth. There are, we've covered probably about 75 to 80% of the areas that are proposed for shelterwood logging so far. It's taken quite a lot of time. We found some great stuff. Some of the forest is kind of middling forest, but some of it's, there's some great stuff out there. Here's a great big white oak that we found in the shelterwood unit. Across the state of Kentucky, white oaks like this are disappearing rapidly. There's statewide forest inventory data that shows these are going away, largely to feed the bourbon industry for barrels and for export to Asia and Europe. But large white oaks outside of the Beaver Meadows National Forest are going to be something you're not going to find in Kentucky in a few years. Here's another area. This is part of a strip of old growth that we found in a proposed sheltering unit. So this is, I did a lot. You can't necessarily tell by the size of the tree how old it is, but my graduate work was on this. I've quartered hundreds and hundreds of trees and researched this stuff, so I've got a pretty good eye for it. This is a northern red oak. This is probably about 130, 140 years old is my guess. It's hard to tell perspective. It's about this big around, great big tree. It's a second growth tree, but it's very large, larger than you typically get in a second growth forest anymore. And this is a bona fide old growth tulip poplar. There's a bunch of them in that stand. Again, it's all proposed for cutting. Here's some other stuff. Here's a really nice chestnut oak here, really nice black oak, and it's fantastic. These are probably 130-ish year old trees, but again, we're starting to confer that old growth structure to a secondary forest. When you lose those, you're not able to get what things that derive from there. So large den trees, large canopy gaps, large snags, those are all really important habitat components of old growth forests. And here's a bona fide old growth tulip poplar that's probably in the 300 to 500 year old range, also the shelterwood unit that we found. You notice we're measuring trees in almost all of these. It's one of the things we do. Data matter, and we really try to record a lot of these things. So rear plant conservation. One of the positive things the Forest Service is looking at, again, this comes out of a lot of conversations and efforts towards collaboration with Kentucky Heartwood and the Office of Nature Preserves and the Forest Service. is to try to support and recover rare plant communities. And there are these sort of enigmatic, remnant, almost prairie-like plant-type communities out in the forest. They were probably much more prevalent in the areas where most of the communities are now, because the land was more flat and rolling as opposed to dissected by all the cliff lines. So you probably have more history of fire to keep those open before settlement. But there are these plant communities that are kind of grassland type communities, and right now they're mostly restricted to a handful of roadsides and power line corridors. They're not everywhere. Some of them are known, some of them aren't known. And most of these pictures are from some that are just outside of the project area. We haven't fully inventoried them up there, but the Nature Preserves Office has a lot of data from there. So the proposal calls for enhancement of known sites, planting of rare species, and then that roadside thinning really fits into that. So it's work that we really support. If it's done well, it can be a really positive thing. But it has to be done correctly and in the right spots. But there's just some beautiful flora. This is a great power line right away. There's just, again, some of these power line right aways are just fescue and junk, but some of them have some amazing remnants of natural communities. So this is a little bit of a wonky thing, but it's going to get into sort of some of the alternatives that we want to put out there. Because where we're coming out from an organization is not saying no management, we're saying there's better and different management the Forest Service needs to consider. So this graph is something the Forest Service published. It's in their scoping document. It's using stand ages that the Forest Service has in their inventories. And those data that they have, they're okay. We have access to that too, but they've missed a lot. But they're okay at a coarse scale to work with. So what this is these are age classes, decades of how old the forest is, and it assumes that a forest is even aged, and sometimes they're not. And this is how many acres. The IRMA is the project area. It's the Integrated Resource Management area. But that's just the project area. So these are the age class distributions. I added these in here. So 0 to 10, up to 250 to 259 over here. And this clump here, this is the historical logging period. So this is that 1890 to 1930 was when most of the forests in Kentucky were cut. You have a few little things that are out here, and then there are things that are older that are hidden out there. These blips here, the sort of early 80s and 90s in here. This is curious. I see the inventory that Iowa has a little more here, but this is all that young forest that those little green spots in that map earlier. So the Forest Service, their main reason for logging in this project and almost all the projects is creating early sterile habitat, because they say there's not enough on the landscape. Is it for deer, for turkey, for grouse, for a lot of migratory songbirds. Again, it's important for a lot of those species, but historically we didn't have chainsaws running through the forest and clearing out that much forest. It's not part of the natural disturbance regime of these forests. So it's a little bit, there's a lot of mystery to understanding how those things existed and supported the wildlife species that need those on the landscape. But it wasn't chainsaws on a large scale. When the Forest Service says we don't have enough early sterile habitat, what they're talking about is this 0 to 10 age class. So they're looking at these forests in age classes. And if you don't have enough 0 to 10 age class at the inventory stand level that the Forest Service has created through their work, they say we don't have enough early sterile habitat for wildlife species. So their goals are to meet their forest plan goals for having enough of 0 to 10 age class in a given area. And there's not enough on the landscape relative to what they say in the management plan. But there's other ways to do this. This is, heavy logging is not the only way, and it's not the best way we argue to do that on the landscape. So old-growth forests tend to be out here. When they talk about early sterile habitat, it's in here. The stuff out here isn't really achieving either of these things so much. So what are the alternative solutions for early sterile habitat? This is the thing we think about a lot, because while we are generally opposed to large-scale logging on the national forest, that does not mean we aren't concerned with species that need grassy, brushy habitat. It would be disingenuous to say that those species are not important on the landscape. So canopy gaps are hard to get good photos of, but they are out there. And this is an interesting one. This was in the Redwood District, 120-year forest, but some trees fell, and you can just see this very different light dynamic. And a lot more brushy stuff growing up in this gap in the forest. Trees fall. And one thing that doesn't get discussed enough, we think, is that old growth forests, when you get forests that get big trees, when big trees fall, they create big gaps in the forest. Big gaps in the forest create what's called functional early cereal habitat. So if you have a younger forest, say a 90-year-old forest, and you've got trees that are maybe 10-inch diameter, and a windstorm comes in and knocks a couple of those trees down, it's not going to really change the light environment on the ground for the plants, and then the wildlife species. It's going to knock a couple trees down, might be a couple patches of light, and those trees themselves are going to grow in, it's going to be shady quickly. You get some 3-foot diameter trees out there, windstorm knocks a few of those down, they're going to take out a lot with them and create big patches where you're going to end up with blackberries and briars and saplings and really good higher quality habitat at that patch scale, and that is part of old growth forest dynamics. So it may seem counterintuitive, but by allowing forests to grow into age classes and size classes that most forestry tries to avoid or sees as a bad thing, you can actually promote the development of patch scale early cereal habitat that is good for wildlife species.
It's also really important to remember that while the argument that the Forest Service will always make about our early cereal habitat is that we need to be always maintaining some area that we're never quite getting to that 0 to 10 age class. We always have to be chasing their tail in that way. It's important to remember when you look at Google Maps, you look at an atlas, you see the big green blob in the neighborhood national forest. But in reality, what you're looking at is a matrix model situation where you have in that big green blob minority of public land interspersed with lots of different private land, where, especially right now, because of the elevation of road prices, there's a lot of forest management going on. There's a lot of logging, which is creating this early cereal condition in huge quantities, and in places that are directly adjacent to the places the Forest Service is in a panic about getting that habitat into. So when you consider all this stuff at the landscape scale, private and public, we have the room to approach these things differently, whether to allow a natural service like Jim just described, or some of the other approaches Jim's about to describe.
Yeah, that context really matters, and it's something the Forest Service tends to not really want to take into serious consideration. Another way of maintaining early cereal habitat is these fire-maintained communities. So we think that historically, part of the way we had more permanent or semi-permanent brushy and grassy habitat for these wildlife species wasn't that we were having these massive windstorms and certainly not chainsaws knocking down huge amounts of forests on rapid cycles. It was that there was fire that periodically came through areas that had low canopy density that maintained those types of habitats in certain areas. So you had your early cereal habitat and your old growth too in that landscape. And so that's one of the reasons that we're supportive of some of this woodland fire management, because we think that long term it's probably the best approach to being able to manage for this wider range of habitats on a really small land base. The roadside thinning the Forest Service has proposed, we're generally supportive of that. It's good for these wood lilies are disappearing, they hang out in these margins. So logging back in the grouse, there's a lot of studies that show that grouse love these sort of roadside margins. So the idea is if they push these back about 60 feet on either side, you're creating, again, functional habitat that can be maintained, and also maintained in a way that when they remove those trees, you don't have to build new roads to do it. Management of the wildlife openings. Again, it's something that we're generally supporting. So you have these openings that right now are mostly in fescue or some type of crop rotation. In a different proposal the Forest Service put out a couple of years ago, they're still developing, they're talking about converting most of the wildlife openings in the London district to native vegetation, so native grasses and wildflowers or different pollinator species. We really support that. So combining that restoration with thinning out from those areas to create a gradient, it's called ecotone, can be really beneficial in creating some, extremely high quality habitat. And as you know, clear cuts and little shelterwood sites. So as I mentioned, the Forest Service has this crop tree release where they want to go in and cut down a handful of usually red maples or poplars that are competing with oaks and hickories and some pines that are coming up in these these areas that we really have a logging for. Well, an alternative approach would be to cut down most of, instead of just a few of the poplars and red maples that are overabundant in these sites, cut most of those down, leave the oaks, leave the hickories, leave the pines, and there's only a minority of the trees in there. So if they cut down most of those low value, low ecological value trees, you would be recreating early sterile habitat in those same sites while also promoting the release of those mass-producing trees that are good for wildlife over the long term. So we can combine those two habitat goals all in the same locations in some ways that can be very effective. This is a functional early cell habitat and a blowdown and proposed Oldgrowth condition, as I was describing a few moments ago. So this is one of the areas the Forest Service has talked about adding in as Oldgrowth. It's along the Rockcastle River. It's a hemlock mixed mesophytic forest. It's about 130, 150-year-old forest. Big hemlocks about this big, not dead yet. And we were walking through here just a couple weeks ago, and the soil's really thin on this slope. There's been a blowdown. It's about 2 acres in size. But it's full of blackberry briars and saplings like this. I mean, this is picture-perfect grouse habitat. They love this type of landscape position where you get a lot more of the species that tend to produce the catkins and forage that they like. You see this sort of stem density that's pretty ideal, and it's happening on its own naturally as a function of that forest gaining that age and being allowed to have that natural disturbance. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but there's also alternative methods of forestry that we've suggested to the Forest Service as another approach. So structural complexity enhancement, thermal schlag. These approaches that are sort of outside of traditional forestry training in our region, but they are more fine-scale management. So cutting out a group that might, say, taking an acre patch and removing most of those trees and a little bit of thinning around the edge that better mimics the type of disturbance that we were illustrating, the type of disturbance our forests evolved with. And then, again, the idea is it's functional early sterile habitat. It's good for songbirds, it's good for grouse, it's good for turkey. And it's in a patchwork mosaic in a way that is available to the wildlife, but also doesn't clear out, 40 to 50 acres at a time, or create sections of forest that are 300 acres that hardly have a tree, over 40 years old. Restoration of beaver meadows and wetland complexes. It's a subject that is not talked about enough, and a lot of folks think that beaver are a nuisance. But the reality is that beaver were probably crucial in creating and maintaining a number of important habitats, and their loss is probably driving the loss of a lot of other species. This is a really fantastic beaver wetland complex in the Cane Creek watershed. The type of forage and stem densities around it are all just ideal grouse habitat with alders and birches and all these sorts of species, and it's created and maintained by beaver. Long-term, restoring more beaver to some of these watersheds and allowing beaver to do what beaver do could actually be a tremendous benefit to a wide range of wildlife species as well as water quality. I mean, again, people talk smack about beaver all the time, but that's gorgeous. That's absolutely gorgeous. You can think that's, Eastern Kentucky. Now, a very sad part of this is our hemlock trees are dying. I suspect that most of you are probably aware, but if you're not, there's an invasive bug called the Hemlock woolly adelgid that has moved into Kentucky, and it's killing our hemlocks. And it is probably going to kill all of our hemlocks without some sorts of chemical treatments, which is something that we're involved in Austin. That's our program on that we're working with the Forest Service and the Kentucky Division of Forestry. But the reality is most of our hemlock trees are going to die probably in the next decade. And they're already starting to die in far eastern Kentucky and further south, Green County, some of Liberty County, and even Laurel County. We're starting to see it. This is a picture from the Smokies from about 10 years ago. Those are all dead hemlocks. This is down in Beaver County. We took that just this May. And it was definitely from hemlock woolly belgic. We saw a bunch of them. About 25% of its foliage left. That tree will probably be dead next year. The tree is about that big around. Tiny, tiny little bugs killing our last big giants. They spin these little white fuzzies and they infest the trees. They basically suck out all the sugars out of the leaves, and after several years, the trees starve. It's a tragedy. It's unbelievable. But it's also a really important consideration in thinking about the need for early cereal habitat in this project area, and whether or not we need several thousand acres of large-scale logging to create that for wildlife species. So on this map, so here's the project area. All of these green and dark green areas, those are areas in the Forest Service inventories they have showing as being substantially full of hemlocks. There's variability. Some of those areas you go into, it's patchy. Some of the areas that don't show as hemlock have hemlocks. But it gives you sort of, a coarse picture of how much hemlock is out there. And they've got a little over 5,000 acres of hemlock forest inventory in the project area. A little over 1,100 acres are in the treatment program, which means we have a chance of saving them. Some of those might already be lost. Is that where some of them are in Austin?
Yeah, we're at one of the things we do as part of our economic program is try to help public land management agencies direct resources to the best places on the ground where we have the best chance of saving species. And the thing we're running into is where assumptions that were made about how long the chemicals that are used were effective are turning out to be less than correct. And we have probably lost a great many trees than we thought we could originally save just by getting our timing wrong. There's not a good news clause at the end of the story, but that's just,
So these areas with the light blue outlines are areas that are in the treatment program. So there's just a few that are kind of scattered. Just working with those numbers, we expect about 3,800 acres of hemlock forest in the project area to die in the next decade. It's heartbreaking. Again, if we're going to talk honestly about management goals for early cereal habitat, these are the areas that the Forest Service mostly considers as filling the need for old growth forest communities in the project area. They're going to be gone. But they will be providing certain habitat for certain species. So that's something on balance that really needs to be considered.
And I think an important thing to think about this too is what we're talking about what the Forest Service wants to do in this area of our forest. It's also important to think about things that we might want them to be doing that they are not. What opportunity are we passing up when we take these kinds of actions? One of those things, it could fairly be said, is a more aggressive program to save hemlocks. Another is to build out more recreational infrastructure. So it's good to keep that in the back of our minds. This is what they want to do. They're also not doing some things that a lot of us, at least me, would like to see them do.
Yeah, we'll get to that again here in just a second. So this is the process. The Forest Service, it's a federal agency. There's a process that they go through that is formal. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through that and explain where we're at, because I help you understand where public input has the most impact. So back around, I was looking at my records, around April of 2016, the Forest Service started these what we call collaborative meetings. So public meetings that they invited people to, some field trips to talk about this general area and what were the concerns and interests people had for this area. We were at all of those meetings, and predominantly what people came there to talk about was recreation. about trails, talking about recreational access and the need for more recreational management. As you may have noticed, I didn't mention trails or campgrounds other than as points of reference at all, because none of that flowed through into this project. So the people we're coming to these meetings mostly to talk about is not actually what showed up in the project. So back in March of 2018, they put out their scoping document with a 30-day comment period. It's an 8-page document, have the maps, also saying here's what we propose to do. We submitted very detailed comments on that. We put out information for the public, and a number of people also submitted comments during that comment period. Forest Service is now developing what's called environmental assessment. It's a requirement that they have, though there's political changes on the horizon that both the Forest Service and Congress have tried to get through to make it so they don't have to do that. But they've been developing environmental assessment that'll go into the project with a little more fine detail and talk about the likely environmental impacts. And when that is released, there will be another 30-day comment period. We were expecting that anytime. So we expected it's going to be delayed because of the shutdown, but that could happen at any time. So that's great. Now, after that, the Forest Service will consider those comments, and sometimes they will go back and change things at that stage. It's not too late to make even substantive changes. I mean, they can even drop the whole project. We've seen them drop projects at that stage, but we don't think they will, and overall, that's not what we want them to do. We want them to change it. At a certain point, they will issue what's called a draft decision notice and draft finding of no significant impact. These are formal documents that say, we have decided on this course of action, but it's technically a draft, and then at that point, members of the public who've gone through certain parts of the process can file a pre-decisional objection, which is sort of a quasi-legal administrative objection that has to be based on legal or regulatory flaws with the plan. So they could put out the worst thing ever that was just not backed up by logic or much science, but as long as they dot the I's and cross the T's, they can probably do it. But chances are we'll end up filing an objection unless they make substantial changes. After that, there will be a meeting with the Forest Service. They have the opportunity to change it again, and in the end, they'll issue a final decision finding no significant impact. I've seen them change projects at this stage. I've seen them change them at this stage. I've seen them change them here as well. So it's not too late. They make changes at all these different stages. And if you're interested in this and the type of approach that Kentucky Heartwood is taking, even if you didn't get comments in earlier, we did. I mean, we represent, we've got about 700 members, and we do this for our members. And so we try to represent people in that process as well. So Heartwood.org, or this URL here, this is the specific one for this project. If you want to copy that down, or if you don't, you can go to our website and you can get it from us. So that's my PowerPoint. That's what I was doing this week. So from here, questions, comments, concerns.
Why? Okay, let's assume, then is it right to assume, what are the Forest Service people, why is there a political culture that matches like a Heartwood view of protecting forests that appears more scientific for someone who loves forests? I can imagine like historically more grass and obvious reasons of just getting paid. Yeah. Is it like that now? Is it something to do with their schooling? Like, is it some kind of group speak about like how dozer operators like that?
Yeah, it's complicated, right? I mean, these things are really complicated. A really important thing is that the Forest Service, as much as I might not like it, is required by what's called the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act to produce some timber. Now, it doesn't set an amount, but that is supposed to be part of their portfolio. They're supposed to have a sustainable management for recreation and clean water and wildlife and timber. These are all supposed to be in all together things are supposed to manage for. But they don't have to manage for it in the ways that they are. Now there's political drivers. So just recently, the administration put out an executive order insisting the Forest Service increase the amount of timber being cut. And while the narrative about that was about dealing with wildfires out west, historically we know that most of the volume on national forests being cut in the last, certainly in the last 20 years, is actually coming from southeastern forests. And so this is where most of that is made up for in southeastern forests. Fortunately, so in the last 15 years, not as bad as Kentucky. But there are also cultural issues. I'm going to let Austin talk about the cultural stuff because he endured forestry school at UTK and survived.
Yeah, let's. The way I think about this is we have two. So what foresters believe that they are doing is what foresters are taught that they are doing in forestry schools. And the central conceit of that, the central concept in academic forestry, which is the thing that gets expressed in these big logging plans, is that what we're doing, no matter what else we're doing, the thing we are always doing is we are recreating the natural disturbance regimes that happen in forests. And therefore, silvicultural actions, which is, to say deciding which trees to cut and which not to cut, is therefore just an extension of natural processes and also kind of therefore always benign. And that's just not questioned. So, but that's a kind of a problem of every professional class. People believe certain premises about what they have been educated to do. And the thing is there's a culture of that's how this job works, this is what logging does, that's not particularly open to the counterexamples. Right, so for example, this one's really important, it's really important in this project, it's really important in all logging that's done on both private and public land. So it was more safe to assume that forest management logging was ecologically neutral or mimetic of natural disturbance in a world that did not have an abundance of invasive species, in which humans had not moved around plant genetic material as much as we have today. So now when we build a road or a log landing, we're doing that in a world where there's Lespedeza seed and honeysuckle seed and autumn olive seed and privet seed and all these plants that are fundamentally changing our forests, have fundamentally changed our forests, especially in urban areas. That's the new environment, and a profession, is an institution. It's a big ship, and it takes a long time to steer it. And that's compounded by the fact that the profession is mostly embedded within a big government institution like the Forest Service, which makes it an even more clumsy vehicle. So we're living in this new world where actual problems are the understory of our forest is becoming all bush honeysuckle, and our keystone tree species in a lot of our forests is going extinct. But because of the inability to adapt quickly to the 21st century forest problems, we're still, at the institutional level, obsessed with how much 0 to 10 H class forest we have. Right? So there are no villains really in this story. I'm sure you can find one here and there. But what we just really have is a way of thinking about forest and our environment largely that just kind of belongs to yesterday's problems and hasn't really adapted well to today's. Yeah. That's kind of the situation. They are, but they're, they're like you and me in that they're stuck in their ways. These are just, when they went through grad school, the thing, like a common problem, common thing to hear from a forester or, forest management professional of a certain age is, oh no, we're going to lose all of our oak. Oh no. That's true in certain circumstances. Forests do tend to be getting a little more mapley, a little less oaky. It's just people, you settle in as the expert in getting oak to grow back. And when other problems that have a little more urgency come along, it's just not in your silo. And that's a lot of what we deal with.
And the Forest Service, forestry is essentially an agricultural science that integrates with ecology, but it's not ecology, and it also mixes in sort of with your values. And as I said earlier tonight, management, it involves trade-offs, and it depends on what you want to see and what you're willing to accept. So for certain land managers, the benefits of temporary early cereal habitat outweigh the impacts of invasive species, and that's a value judgment, right? I mean, you can quantify things, but that's a value. The other part of this is that the Forest Service is a big bureaucracy, and there are people in the Forest Service who don't necessarily agree with some of these parts of it, but it's not their call. And the Forest Service employs a lot more people working sort of in the suite of timber management than they do working on ecology, for example. So Danny Boone National Forest has one botanist who's mostly at his desk and no ecologists. And while they are understaffed, even with some of their timber folks, they have far more timber people working than they do people doing, for example, plant surveys, which is pretty much zilch. So it's a mix of cultural, institutional, economic, and then you also have to look at Congress, right? So when we say, I mentioned how at those early meetings people said, hey, we need trails, we need campgrounds. These are the things that most people are interested in getting out in their national forest. And as much as the Forest Service might want to entertain those things, where the rubber meets the road, they don't have the money for it. So the Forest Service the Danny Boone National Forest gets money allocated from, we're in Region 8 based out of Atlanta. So Congress gives the Forest Service money for different sorts of activities, and then that gets doled out to the different regions and then doled out to the different forests. Well, recreation isn't getting squat. They don't have enough to maintain what they've got, let alone add new trails or new infrastructure. And so if they get money for planning, vegetation management projects or these restoration projects, which also always includes timber, they can't just take that same money, that pot of money, and say, well, actually, the public really wants, trails and a new campground. They can't do that. And so there's also, sort of a congressional aspect to this as well.
Yeah, it's but it's all politics is political. So there's this flow chart. We have to develop an expertise in the legal processes that produce these big projects. Whether they're good or bad or mixed. And so you have to engage with that stuff. But independent of that is what people want from the forest and the way people communicate what they want. So it's not to be missed that both London Laurel County and Corbin Whitley County have pegged big chunks of their tourism strategy to ecotourism, adventure tourism, promoting running races and adventure races and boat races and all this stuff. There are this has become my mantra to people when they ask ask about, okay, what can I do? We can be right about elements of the science and make arguments make legalistic arguments about whether or not they're meeting the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act. But the fact is, the thing that has the most potential to change these projects, to make them better, is rooms full of people who want something different and aren't afraid to say so. And that's all. I mean, we are meaningless without that kind of engagement.
Yeah, I mean, the more people that plug in and express themselves, the more positive change can be effected in a project like this. Even though it seems daunting because you're going against all this inertia. But we've done it. We've done it before. We'll do it again. But a lot of it comes down to the types of involvement that people have and the support that we get as we try to represent some of these perspectives with the Forest Service.
Could you do like a short version of LBL?
Yeah. Land Between the Lakes is in western Kentucky, and it's a national recreation area that's managed by the U.S. Forest Service. It's pretty unique in that it was acquired by the federal government by the TVA mostly in the 1960s through a series of eminent domain actions that removed over 4,000 people from their homes and created a 170,000-acre national recreation area. Over the years, it was transferred to the Forest Service in '98, and it's been degraded substantially since, while the agencies, through action, deliberate actions and neglect, work to try to erase the history of the people who lived there, many of whom still live around that area. The Forest Service was ramping up their timber program substantially, and over the last decade, efforts to try to address some problems with the logging there had not been fruitful at all. And a number of things sort of lined up at just the right time and in just the right way. And the Forest Service had proposed about a 4,000-acre logging project adjacent to another couple thousand acres that they were in the process of logging. And we started integrating with some folks out there that we do and others. And long story short, in about a month, we worked with some county government folks and others to host a public meeting on a cold February night and had several hundred people show up, all against the logging there. We had the Republican Congressman Ed Whitfield, who's now gone, supportive of calls to stop logging at LBL. And we've had support from both Democratic and Republican judge executives and a number of locals across the spectrum. And within less than a year, we got the Forest Service to withdraw that timber project and institute what was effectively a moratorium on logging at LBL that still holds. They've had a couple other timber projects, including one that had already been approved with timber mark, that they tried to move forward with again that they backed off on because the local public was so adamant that they not do that. It's a pretty exceptional story, but it was something that came down to ultimately, as Austin said, all politics are local. You had folks from across the political spectrum working together, working with local county government, saying what we want with this public land in our counties that we are tied to is different than what the Forest Service is saying, and we're not going to put up with it. And it was powerful enough that the Forest Service backed off, and now we're working on trying to sort of craft a different way forward with management there, which is a whole other story, but there's an opening to try to create something different. Would that happen because so many people stood up with a lot of tenacity and pushed the agency to do that. So it can happen. Any other
Someone
questions?
on the Facebook Live asked, elaborate on Angel Hollow.
I'm hesitant to elaborate on Angel Hollow because recreational use of off-trail sites is starting to have increasing impacts in sensitive areas. I hesitate even mentioning it in this proposal, but it's part of it. It's important to mention. It's a piece of forest that is partially old growth, some secondary and some primary old growth. That it had some graduate research done there to take a more in-depth look, and it's an area that has been treated heavily to protect hemlocks from hemlock overindulgence. So it's a great area. I'm not going to encourage anybody to go there in order to sort of protect some of the sensitive aspects of it. But it's public lands and it's open, and it's really cool. What's that?
What happens to the 50 years down the road?
The maples?
Yeah,
Oh, they like that coppice, like those multiple stems.
Because they can't be as strong with our
Yeah. What I think is going to happen, so we're watching a process play out right now. And the conventional assumption is that what's going to happen is that all these maples in the mid-story, regardless if it's those clusters or just mid-story maples under an intact canopy, are just shading things out, and oaks won't be able to establish. I think those maple clusters, red maple gets rot really easily. It's a weak wood. I suspect historically that one of the things that keeps it in check relative to like oaks and hickories is that ice storms, and historically we had these passenger pigeons that they would blacken the sky for days, and they were big birds. And there's a lot of stories about this. I mean, they would land in these canopies and just snap all these canopies, just like ice. So between ice and passenger pigeons and wind breaking red maple and introducing rot, I suspect those trees decline more quickly than the oaks that tend to outlive them. Now, those multi-stem maples, I don't think they're going to live for 50 or 100 years because they're weak, but I think that they're also very dense and create a lot of shade that does inhibit oaks and some of the other more light-needing species. So I think that long-term, their impact isn't going to be their long-term presence. I think it's going to be the effect that they have on shade and species composition in terms of what comes next. So it's possible that you'll see these maples reproduce and create more of a self-sustaining red maple dominated environment. But if the forest is sort of carefully tended so that oaks can get better established, I think that those oaks are going to outlive those red maples. It's one of the reasons that in terms of that mid-story removal that they plan on for a couple thousand acres is something that we're generally supportive of, just not following up with logging of the overstory down the road. Because things are skewed in the forest, and some of the understanding with the red maple issue has to do with fire suppression, but it does seem to be much more complicated than that. But in the meantime, thinning out those maples in the mid-story in some areas can help oaks better establish, better reproduce in that understory, and sort of set up the next generation so that when natural disturbance happens, and it will, that there are more oaks in that understory. But we don't need to accelerate that canopy disturbance with large-scale logging, especially in a situation where that understory isn't properly managed, because then we just see the recreation of this problem, where we just have that red maple just ends up actually getting a benefit as opposed to helping to push things towards oaks. A lot of the narrative from the forestry community and forest products industry is that we don't have a lot of oak in the understory and a lot of our oak forests, and that the solution to that, and that what's driving that problem, is that we're not having enough logging to create enough light environment to reproduce those oaks. But in reality, what's happening is cutting out those oaks in the overstory is pushing our forest more towards maple dominance, because managing that understory, which is what you really need to do, costs money. It doesn't just make money. So if you just want to make money, you cut out your oaks and your forest is more likely to convert to more red maple and poplar. But if you want to invest in that forest and tend that forest in a more ecologically appropriate way, the concern needs to be managing that understory and mid-story. But again, that's not where you make money. So, as Austin mentioned, our forest, the State of Beaver National Forest, lives in a matrix of private and public land. And most of the time on private land, that's not happening. Most landowners who aren't going to invest that way in their property. But on our public national forests, we can do that. There's always economic issues, budgets, and things to work with, but we can promote that type of management in a much better way. So I think that part of the solution is some of that mid-story work, or letting that overstory, if you've got a 100-year-old oak forest, white oak, can live several hundred years. So these are not old forests. So, to most foresters and conventional forestry, a 100-year-old oak tree needs to be cut because as trees get older, you get more time for cavities to develop, canopies to break, trees to fall, things that in most forestry you don't want to see because that's a product that's not coming out of the forest. But in terms of developing a rich old growth type forest structure, those things are really important. And so, we had that quote early on about, after 10 years, forests developing, old forest, mature forest type characteristics. 100 years old is, some will call that even old growth, or say it's just as good as old growth. But 100-year-old, oak forest is a young forest, really ecologically speaking. So it's almost like we're talking, sometimes we're in two different worlds talking about the same thing.
It's important to remember that, people can, it's easy to become doctrinaire, but, if you're a private forest owner, you look at the white oak and the red oak prices that are chasing them, and have been chasing for the last few years. And, if you hit these braces or something, you're not going to cut their forest. Private landowners are under tremendous pressure from market forces. Our public lands are the one part of our forest where we don't have to think about the woods that way. It's our one opportunity to do things with ecological or recreation, these other values at the top of the list, as opposed to secondary if we have enough money left. That's really important because that doesn't seem to be the philosophy that NMC, even though it's our only chance, really to act on that philosophy.
So can I touch on this monetary gain public lands? There is monetary gain, we don't want that to be driving force, but there is monetary gain. Can you explain to me the monetary gain, how it works for the company? So does the government contract, our private contract goes to the law that they get this, educate me on the money made on the other things, because that is to me, I'd say probably one of the biggest issues, more so than what I would like to say. Conservation, growth of this tree, growth of that tree, this invasive species. In my mind, everything goes down.
It's complicated for sure. Jim can say more technically about exactly how the money flows, but there are timber receipts, right? So a timber project that's marked and makes all the way through the legal process is bid out to a private contractor, or a local or non-local logger, someone who has all certifications, and so they pay for the right to cut the trees. What happens after they take them off the side is their business, for the most part. And then what are the paths of the revenues? Timber receipts then go to Washington.
So there's a number of different mechanisms, and honestly, I've been doing this for 20 years. It's still confusing. It's a bit of a black box phenomenon. But so in a lot of these projects, the environmental analysis, the Forest Service will crunch numbers and say there will be, X number of dollars of, timber receipts, and sometimes they'll even say extra economic, input, peripherally that comes out of that. But they don't include in that a lot of the overhead and bulk of Forest Service management, peripheral management, and expenses that go into that. So there's a lot of stuff that doesn't end up in the cost ledger that would affect what they're saying is the net positive. There haven't been any good analyses of the economics of timber on national forests in a long while, but in the between like 1998, 99, and about 2003 maybe, there were several attempts at trying to really dissect the federal forest timber program. And I recall a member of Congress had asked the Office of Management and Budget to do an audit, and they basically couldn't even really do it because it was so convoluted in the way things were put here and there and all that. But there were several reports, both from OMB and a couple of different nonprofits, that ranged from the Forest Service losing a net $500 million to $1.5 billion a year nationally on the federal timber program. Now that was when the federal timber program was a lot larger. That was kind of around when things declined in terms of how much the Forest Service was logging. And those, numbers, some people in the Forest Service disputed those numbers, but there were 3 reports ranging from, again, $500 million to $1.5 billion. So it's really debatable overall about, is money gained or is money lost overall on this? Now, when you sell it on that project, maybe there's a gain, but how much the roads management, how much of the timber cruisers and planning and all this other stuff is not included in that ledger. It's not always clear. Now, when they sell that timber, that money goes into a couple different funds. And some of that money can go back into the project area, but it's limited in what it's spent on. So it can be spent on basically remediation of sites. So some of that pre-commercial thinning or crop tree release on the old clear cuts can be paid for with timber receipts or road work in the project area. So if Forest Service doesn't have nearly enough money to take care of the roads that we've got, so they can take some of that money can go towards fixing roads in the project area. But it can't go to trails for recreation. This whole suite of projects. This is only one project. There's 2 other big projects in the forest right now that are in different phases of analysis like this. They had district rangers come from every district to talk about all these projects. They didn't use the word logging once. Not once. They talked about management, talked about habitat, and yet right now we've got this project, which, depending on how you look at it, about 4,000 acres of logging. The Redbird District, we're looking at 3,200 acres of shelter wood cutting that they're proposing. And then we're looking at a project that's going to probably come out soon on the Cumberland District near Cameron, like about 1,200 acres. And in talking about that, they publicly use the word logging. So, and again, it's I like the district ranger, I like the forest supervisor, but it's there's a lot going on. It's complicated.
So somebody's.
I'm just wondering, what about the private contractors who do the logging and sell the timber, however they sell the timber? Where are they mostly from? Like, what kind of companies are they? Is there consistency?
So logging on the Daniel Booth been pretty low for the last decade because, Kentucky already had some very successful litigation in the late 1990s and some good organizing in the early 2000s, kept things pretty low. The main contractor that we've seen doing logging, most of, at least on the Stearns district, which is where there's been logging on in the Cumberland district near Moorhead that wrapped up as part of the Ice Storm Salvage project that went on for about 10 years. I don't know who got those contracts. On the south end, there's the Rock Creek project in Curry County, and then the Freeman Fork project, which is a small one. And both of those, there was an operator that we saw that was, I think they were, I forget the name, but I think they were out of Williamsburg, Lily County, just a small operator. I don't think a lot of operators actually like to bid on national forest stuff because the reality is that even with those shelter wood cuts, some of the trees that get left are valuable trees, and there's a number of stipulations that they have to abide by. So, for example, when it's really wet like this, they're not supposed to be logging on national forest in order to try to not damage the soil. It doesn't mean it doesn't always happen, but on private land they can just go ahead and do it, for example. So they're supposed to wash their equipment to try to limit invasive species spread. Now, when that redbird project for Sheva all those invasives, apparently they did that. It doesn't always work. Or maybe they didn't do it and they said they did, I don't know. But there's extra things they have to do, and as long as there's a steady stream of logging to be had on private land, it's not as attractive to be cutting on national forest. So, but I mean, two years ago, the Forest Service approved logging the Greenwood project, which is several thousand acres. There's going to be a lot going on with that. I plan on following pretty soon to see what's going on with timber bids. So what happens is the Forest Service will approve a big project like this, when they break it up into timber sales and then go through a bidding process. And then that plays out. So, and that's not, you can get information on that, but they don't, that's not like on the website or anything like that.
Typically, is the contractors that are doing the logging and the restoration companies the same, or do they bring in, like, looking at these grassland burnings and things of that nature?
Yeah.
Hire multi-tier companies to do that? Or?
Yeah, it's usually different. So the burning is mostly done by the Forest Service, sometimes with the Kentucky Division of Forestry, and sometimes Nature Conservancy and some others might also plug into doing those burns. The non-commercial thing, it's sometimes the same operators that can do that. Sometimes they contract it out differently. Sometimes they have their own. It can vary. Well, I'll put in a pitch for Kentucky Heartwood. If you find any of this information valuable, we're a small organization. We've got 4 staff at about 2.5 full-time equivalent covered to do all this stuff. We're anticipating a pretty big budget shortfall this year, and we have to pay for the space and things like that. So, we exist because of our members. So, if you're not already a member and you're interested in plugging in, sure love to have you. You don't have to sign up and get our information uploads and all that. If you want to stay plugged into this, or you love these areas and want to look at things more closely, talk to me, stay in touch. That's what we do.
If you're local, I live right over there. Come over, we'll strategize. This is our forest. It's our public land. We have a vision for it.
Nothing we're putting out there is unreasonable. That's the reality. It could be done, and it could be good. It could be a lot better than they're proposing. And it could meet all the things that they're supposed to do, but in a much better way. So, take some honey buns, drink some coffee, sign up on our email list. And, thanks.
Yeah, well,
Matter of fact,